Open your Bible, if you would please, to Matthew 6. Matthew chapter 6 in our Bible this morning. I'm sure, at least I hope, that you're all aware now that the Sermon on the Mount deals with the subject of the kingdom of heaven. That's what Jesus is dealing with in this 3-chapter sermon in our Bible. He began his most famous sermon describing the people who are in that kingdom. We call that description the Beatitudes, and that's the way the sermon opens. Remember, in that list, the Beatitudes, Jesus is making their exclamations. He's saying here, of all the people on the planet, these are the people who are the most to be envied. These are the people who are the most blessed, is the word he says. And remember, he's saying, blessed the poor in spirit. The verb is not there. When he says, back in chapter 5 and verse 3, blessed, you notice the word are is in italics. He's saying, blessed the poor in spirit, blessed they that mourn, blessed the meek. I mean, these are the people, of all the people on the planet, these are the people that are most to be envied. What a blessed position they're in. And then following that description, Jesus begins to explain the nature of righteousness in his kingdom. This is what it looks like among my people. And then he begins to describe the nature of that. And as he explains the nature of righteousness in his kingdom, he makes, remember, a stunning comment. He tells the audience that day, your righteousness has got to exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, or you cannot make it into my kingdom. And I hope everyone is very familiar now. That is a stunning comment. Because for most of those people then, they didn't know anybody that they would consider to be more righteous than the scribes and Pharisees. These people who copied the law, these people who studied the law. The scribes and the Pharisees, I mean, they were the pinnacle. How could anybody be more? And you tell me my righteousness has got to be greater than that in order to get into the kingdom of heaven? And so Jesus follows that stunning statement in Matthew 5:20 with 6 different examples of a righteousness that exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees. And with every example, he opens that example this way. You have heard that it was said, but I say unto you. And every time he's contrasting a righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees and a righteousness as he, the giver of the law, is interpreting it. And I hope by now, as we made our way through chapter 5, it became very clear to us that a righteousness that exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees is an internal righteousness. It's a righteousness of the heart. And that's why Jesus said, you have heard people say that you can't murder. But I say unto you, if you're angry with somebody, or if you use angry speech towards someone, you have committed murder in your heart. You have heard people say, don't commit adultery. But I am telling you, if you are looking at a woman to lust after her, you have committed adultery in your heart. This is the righteousness that exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees. And that's what he's talking about in chapter 5. And while chapter 5 deals with the nature of righteousness in God's kingdom, chapter 6 deals now with the practice of that righteousness. And chapter 6 opens up with Jesus correcting the religious leaders' mispractice of that righteousness. Earlier, he's correcting their understanding of the nature of it. Now he's correcting the way they mispractice that righteousness. They were doing good things, but they weren't practicing their righteousness the way God intended. And we're going to notice this morning that their mispractice of this righteousness had to do with the way they served in the public arena. Our text this morning, Matthew 6, verses 1 through 6, and then 16 through 18, addresses a special kind of temptation that anyone who serves God publicly faces. I want you to see if you can discover what this temptation is as we read the text. Look at Matthew 6 and verse 1, where Jesus says in his most famous sermon, "Take heed that ye do not your alms before men to be seen of them. Otherwise, you have no reward of your Father which is in heaven. Therefore, when thou doest thine alms, do not sound a trumpet before thee, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may have glory of men. Verily I say unto you, they have their reward. But when thou doest alms, let not thy left hand know what thy right hand doeth, that thine alms may be in secret. And thy Father, which seeth in secret, himself shall reward thee openly. And when thou prayest, thou shalt not be as the hypocrites are, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues and in the corners of the streets, that they may be seen of men. Verily I say unto you, they have their reward. But thou, when thou prayest, enter into thy closet, and when thou hast shut the door, pray to thy Father which is in secret, and thy Father which seeth in secret shall reward thee openly." And then look at verse 16. "Moreover, when ye fast, be not as the hypocrites of a sad countenance, for they disfigure their faces, that they may appear unto men to fast. Verily I say unto you, they have their reward. But thou, when thou fastest, anoint thine head and wash thy face, that thou appear not unto men to fast, but unto thy Father which seeth in secret. And thy Father which seeth in secret shall reward thee openly." What we read this morning were three examples that Jesus used while making his point. And all the examples deal with acts of righteousness that are done publicly. Here the examples are giving and praying and fasting. But the instruction here isn't limited to only those three practices. In our church today, those who serve as ushers or deacons or minister musically or teach a Sunday school class or preach from this pulpit or serve in any public way are assailed by the devil toward a particular sin. In fact, you may have been tempted this way when you gave a contribution in the public offering that we took a few minutes ago and that we'll take at the end of the service for our special offering. You see, in our text, Jesus commands a certain secrecy in our public service for God. He challenges here his audience about keeping public service secret. Keeping public service secret. Now that may sound contradictory. By its very definition, how can public service be secret? I mean, surely that which is public is not secret. But in our passage this morning, Jesus is calling his people to both. He doesn't intend that our public service for Him, He does intend that it has an element of secrecy about it. And that's what our message is all about this morning. Jesus makes His point in verse 1, and then the rest of what we read, and I excluded, the interlude passage that I excluded was a detailed explanation that we call the Lord's Prayer, which we're going to deal with that separately. But he just like he made his point in chapter 5 and verse 20, and he used 6 different examples to illustrate that point. Now he's making another point in chapter 6 and verse 1, and he's using 3 examples to drive that point home. So let's notice this morning 2 considerations that the Lord Jesus makes in the sermon, and here's the first one. First of all, notice Jesus' caution regarding public service. You see it right away in verse 1. Take heed that ye do not your alms before men. So the whole paragraph today begins with Jesus telling us to take heed to something. Now, we know what that word means when we see it in the Bible. We know that word means to beware, or to be on your guard, or to be cautious about something. And so what Jesus is doing in this message today is He is cautioning us about something. And in His caution, we have a prohibition. Don't do your alms before men to be seen of them. Here's the prohibition. The alms that you see listed there in our Bible. Alms is the word righteousness. It's the same word that we see in chapter 5 of Matthew when he talks in verse 6 of those hungering and thirsting after righteousness. When he talks about it in verse 20, your righteousness has got to exceed that of the scribes and Pharisees. This is the same word. So he's saying here, beware, be cautious that you do not practice your righteousness before men in order to be seen of them. And again, as I mentioned earlier in our introduction this morning, this prohibition that Jesus is making is probably more applicable to us. It probably has more reference to the number of us in the auditorium this morning than it did in Jesus' day. As I mentioned, then in His day, the priests and Levites offering the service primarily. But now in the New Testament church, with the gifting that the Spirit of God does to His people, that's why we purposefully read this morning, Jason did to us, the record, one of a few records in the Bible about that gifting out of 1 Corinthians 12. Jesus gives the Spirit of God. He gives people. And then we use those gifts not for ourselves. We use those gifts to serve publicly. And there are many of us that serve. And so this is something that we must all beware of, that we must all be cautious of. And here is specifically the prohibition. It's this: don't serve publicly in order to be seen by others. That's what he's saying. Don't serve publicly in order to be seen by others. If you mark your Bible, the word be seen, that's a really interesting word. It's the word we get our English word theater from. A theater is a place of performance. An audience gathers in a hall and the actors appear on the stage to perform for the pleasure of the audience. Jesus is cautioning that. Don't do your acts of righteousness publicly as though you're on a theater performing before others. That's his caution here. And in chapter 6 here, verse 2 and verse 5 and verse 16 all deal with this same caution about practicing our righteousness in order to be seen by men. And along with the prohibition, there's a consequence. And you see the consequence. Here it is. If you serve to be seen by others, you have no reward from God. That's a sobering consequence. That means the gifting that God has given to you, that He's given it to you to serve His church for His glory. You could spend your life using your gift serving His church and have no reward from the Father. That's His caution. Don't do your public service in order to be seen by others, because if you do, you have no reward of your Father which is in heaven. So this is the premise that Jesus makes here in the passage. Be on your guard. Be cautious that you don't publicly serve God in order that you might be seen of men. If you do, then you have no reward in heaven from your Father. And just like He did in chapter 5, He made His point, and then He gave 6 illustrations to prove it. Now He's made His point in verse 1, and now He's giving 3 illustrations to drive that teaching home. And that leads us to the second consideration this morning, and that is this: Jesus' counsel regarding public service. There are 4 elements here that I want you to think about in this counsel. His counsel regarding our public service, first of all, it's this: continue to serve publicly. You'll notice He says, when. You see that in verse 2? Therefore, He's made His point. Okay, now on that basis, that's what therefore means. Now on that basis, when thou doest thine alms, verse 5, when thou prayest, verse 16, when you fast. The word when here, it's not if, it's when. Jesus fully intends that we are going to be serving. That's His full intention here, that every believer is going to be serving. Jesus doesn't counsel you to stop serving publicly because someone might notice. That's not what He's saying. We shouldn't recoil from public ministry because of the caution that Jesus is giving. And I want to caution us about that this morning. Don't have of the mindset, you shouldn't let your fear that you might not have a right motive when you serve, don't let that fear paralyze you so that you just don't serve at all. Some, especially those in our congregation this morning who are particularly sensitive in your conscience, you could look at that and you could say, you know what, if that is too risky. When I look at my heart and the propensity of it, it could be that I could not serve God publicly with the right motive, so I think it's probably best for me not to do it. That is not what Jesus is telling you. Don't take that mindset. Jesus fully intends, that's why He says, when you do your alms and when you pray and when you fast, He's assuming that that is going to take place among His people. So continue to serve publicly. And then I want you to notice he counsels, strive for secrecy while serving publicly. That's His counsel. Don't stop serving, keep serving, but just as He made His point, strive for secrecy whenever you're serving publicly. New Testament ministry is public. The gifting that God gives to His church, much of that is public service that we are doing. But even in the midst of that public service, Jesus says, be cautious and strive for secrecy while you're serving publicly. And what He means by that is you're not doing this in order to be seen by others so that you have praise of them. Look at what He says in 1 Peter. 1 Peter 4, he's speaking about the exercise of our gifts. This is one of a few passages, along with 1 Corinthians 12, where Jesus is dealing with our gifts. And look at what he says. As every man hath received the gift, even so minister the same one to another as good stewards of the manifold grace of God. As God's Spirit has gifted us, okay, as everybody has received a gift from God for His church, then use that, minister that gift, minister the same, he says, and do it to one another so that you can be a good steward of the manifold grace, this gift that God has given to you. If any man speak, and then he divides these gifts. Some of them are speaking gifts. They're very public gifts. And then some of them they're not verbal gifts. They're manual gifts. They're gifts that are often done not publicly. And so he says, if any man speak, let him speak as the oracles of God. If any man minister, let him do it as of the ability which God giveth. And then notice what I've underlined here, that God in all things might be glorified through Jesus Christ, to whom be praise and dominion forever and ever. Here he's specifically talking about, okay, you have been gifted by the Spirit of God. Okay, use that gift. Use what God has given you. Practice that righteousness. Let that be seen. But don't serve with your glory in mind. Instead, that God in all things may be glorified through Jesus Christ. Clearly, that is the goal. The goal of our service is the glory of God. Now, I know some of us are probably thinking that in this sermon, we are admonished to display our good works, and we are admonished to display them before men. You remember what Jesus said in Matthew 5, verse 16. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works. Jesus is challenging us that, yes, do your good works and let your light shine in front of people so that they can take notice of the good works that you're doing. But then you'll notice that he finishes that saying, and glorify your Father which is in heaven. We are to do our good works, and they should happen in front of men. But we're doing it for the glory of God, as Peter is writing there, and not for our own glory. And in our text, Jesus is exposing the motive of the religious leaders. And that's what we're talking about, right? We're talking about the kind of motive that we have when we serve publicly. And you'll notice what he says there in verse 2 of chapter 6. Don't do it this way, that they may have glory of men. And verse 5, that they may be seen of men. And verse 16, that they may appear unto men to fast. And Jesus is arguing all the way through this part in his sermon, rather than striving for secrecy, we should be driven toward a personal, driven not toward a personal publicity. But though our public works, they are public, we are ministering so that we are hidden. That's our goal. And so that God could be glorified. Instead, we're hidden when Brenda, so lovely, sang this morning, just like a lamb. She's wanting to communicate in the gifting that God has so ably done there, that we would not see Brenda, but that our hearts would be drawn to the words that she is singing about the Savior who, just like a lamb, came and was slaughtered, died for us. She's not wanting you to notice her. She's not wanting you to be so caught on, how's that note? How's the vibrato? How's everything that's musically? How's that all shaking out today? She's not looking to perform. She's looking to minister her gift unseen, so that the message of that song, and that's what music is. It's a verbal gift. It's verbal. Could I say it this way? It's verbal preaching. It's verbal teaching. It's just set to music. And you're doing it so that, okay, I just want the message to get through. And so he's cautioning here in our service, look, don't be a hypocrite. Do you notice that? In all three of the verses, Jesus admonishes them, don't be a hypocrite. In the ancient world, that word was connected to the theater. In the theater, again, actors played parts. And the way they distinguished their different parts that they were playing was by wearing a mask. They would change their masks. So hypocrisy, being a hypocrite, has to do with wearing a mask. And Jesus is saying, don't be a hypocrite when you do your public service. Don't serve with the gift that I'm giving you as though you're on a public stage and you're making a performance and you've got a mask on. He's saying, don't serve that way. Hypocrisy in our service means you're not the real deal. When I'm serving and I've got a mask on, I'm serving because I want you to notice me. If Brenda's serving and she wants you to notice her, she wants you to notice what she looks like. She wants you to notice how she's dressed. She wants you to notice all of the musical notation. She wants you to catch all of that, and she wants you to walk away, and she wants you to say, you know what? Brenda is wonderful. If I'm standing up and I'm preaching, and I want you to notice everything about the way Ron is preaching, and I want you to walk away and say, you know what? Ron preached a great message today. Then I and Brenda would be miserable failures. We would be on a platform performing for an audience, for the audience to walk away and say, wow, what a great job. That's exactly what Jesus is cautioning here. Don't do your public service so that people will look at you and so they will say, wow, what a great job. And they'll go and they'll praise you. Now, it is commendable for us as the people of God to thank people who serve publicly. But for anyone who serves publicly to serve in order to get thanked, that's what Jesus is dealing with here. We are not to serve that way. And that really is the heart here of the passage. He's addressing when spiritual ministers become actors. They give the appearance of being devoted to God, but actually they're devoted to themselves. They're not really interested about what you understand about God through what they sing or say. They're interested in what you understand about them. Are you getting everything about them? That's what he's dealing with. When public serving ministers actually become actors. And you'll notice he says, if you're serving, you're playing your part, you're wearing your mask, you're acting out something or someone that you're really not. Well, if that's what you're doing and you're playing your part, you're serving to be seen of men, then he says, did you notice that very clearly? 3 times he said, they have their reward. That's what he said. You notice it, verse 2, verse 5, and verse 16. That's the way those verses end. They have their reward. The term have, it's a business term. And it has to do with being paid in full. And that's what he's saying there. They have been paid in full for their service. And what they got was the praise of men. That's what they were looking for. That's what they got. And they're getting nothing else. They have been paid in full. They have their reward. That's what he's saying there. There is no future reward. So he's cautioning here. Don't do your public service so that people can see you, so that they will pat you on the back, because if you do that, you have no reward of the Father. And he gives 3 examples to drive home that point. And then he says, okay, now listen, continue to serve publicly. But in your public service, strive for secrecy. And then thirdly, he counsels, God sees your secret service. In every example, did you notice that? In every example that Jesus gave, he's saying, let your service be secret. Let that be that element. When your right hand is giving, make sure your left hand doesn't know about it. Don't go stand on a street corner and pray publicly so that people are going to praise you for your public service. Don't do that, he says. Now, I'm not saying don't go street preach. I'm saying don't go street preach so that people will just notice you and say, wow, look what that guy's doing. And in every case, when you fast, he says, don't disfigure your face so that you're going to make sure that everybody knows, hey, I'm fasting. I am fasting. Don't do that. Matter of fact, when you fast, wash your face, clean yourself up so nobody knows that you're fasting except the one who sees in secret. Fast that way. Pray that way. Give that way. Serve your acts of righteousness that way, he says. And it is a joy to know that God sees. Proverbs 15:3. The eyes of the Lord are in every place, beholding the evil and the good. 2 Chronicles 16:9. For the eyes of the Lord run to and fro throughout the whole earth to show himself strong to those whose heart is perfect toward him. God sees our action. And he sees the heart motivation behind the action. God sees that secret service. And here's the challenge this morning. What Jesus is dealing with us about is this. Can you be satisfied that God alone sees? I know that we want our gifts to be seen by others. We want that. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works. We don't want our good works to be hidden in a closet or under a bushel. We want them to be public. We want people to notice. I want people to notice my Christian testimony. But I don't want them to notice my Christian testimony so that they come and praise me or pat me on the back. No. I want it to be public. But are we content that God alone would see? Are we content with the notice and the praise of God alone? That's what Jesus is driving us to this morning. And He intends that we get everything that the Father intends to give us. God intends to reward our public service, and Jesus intends that we get that. And He's saying, don't do your service so that people notice you and praise you. If you do, you have been paid in full. There is no reward. So God sees our secret service, and then fourthly, God will reward our secret service. He will reward every act of secret service that you have given to Him. Lord willing, it was done in front of people, and it broadened the impact of your own testimony for Jesus Christ. But it wasn't done so that people would praise you. It was done because you're being faithful to God and serving in the way that God has gifted you. That's what you're doing, and God will see it. And Jesus is saying, that's what He's saying. God will see it, and He will reward. He'll do every one of them. Mark 9 and Matthew 10, a cup of water given won't go unrewarded. You're familiar with that. But can I just give us a caution even about looking at eternal reward? Did you know our human nature is so fallen, and our enemy, the devil, is so pernicious that he can turn even our prospect of being rewarded by the Father into a selfish act? Even that, I can look not toward getting praised by you here today. I can be looking at the rewards coming from a Father one day, and even that be an act of my own pride to say, okay, one day I'm gonna strive not to get rewards here. I want to get them all in heaven. And then people will see the rewards that I've gotten there. The devil can turn even that. That's how pernicious he is, and that's how depraved the human heart is. And so we must be cautious. You say, well, how do I know if I'm serving for the reward of the Father and not for the eyes and praise of men? Let me just close this morning with just a couple of applications. These applications are applications when I heard a message when one of my favorite expositors in currently today preaching, Dr. Mark Minnick, he was preaching about gifts and serving. And he made these applications. For those of us who have private gifts, they're not that public in our service. And by that I mean you're not often in front, you're not often on this platform, you're not often standing in front of a classroom teaching or anything like that. Your gifts that God's given you, you're serving in more private ways. Let's ask ourselves this: do I serve just as diligently in private with my gift as I would if I were on the platform and it was observable by all? Do I serve as diligently privately as I would if I were serving publicly on the platform? And then for those of us who serve in more public ways to our congregation here, he says this: is the church body requesting this of me, or am I requesting it of myself? That in itself could be an indication. And then he says this: if the body is requesting it, am I willing to do it imperfectly for the glory of God? If the body is saying, would you consider teaching a Sunday school class? Would your mindset be, oh no, I couldn't do that? And in your mind you're thinking, no, I would want to be able to do it perfectly. I would want to be the best Sunday school teacher. I could never do anything like that. I mean, these are just applications that could help. If I am concerned that it's got to be flawless in order for me to serve, in order for me to sing or sing in the choir or to serve in some way, it's got to be flawless. That could be an indication that I'm concerned about what men think. And so if I don't think I can do it flawlessly, then I can't serve in any public way. That could be an indication that I'm looking for the praise of men. Because if I'm not looking for that, I want to do my best, but if it's not perfect, that's okay. God sees, and God rewards, and that's what we're looking for. So the entire passage it's all centered around Matthew 6:1. That's the point that Jesus makes, and that's what we're walking away from here today with that understanding. We must not serve God with an eye toward what men are thinking. I must not be driven by men noticing what I do. If the praise of men is what I am desiring, that's my goal, then that is all I'm going to get. Their praise will be my full reward. But if I'm striving for secrecy in my service, I want to be faithful to God, so use the gift that God has given me. I want to be faithful to that, but I want an element of secrecy about that. And I'm ministering the gift as though God alone is the audience. God will see, and God will reward. Let's bow for prayer.